already working on creating the European Chamber of Commerce in Sudan. Because the EU supports private sector development and private sector involvement in economic development throughout the world, as we are a community of values, and private sector driven economic development is part of our values. So we've been working very hard for a very long time to come to this point. And since the transitional government took office, we've been engaging with the government also on making a more conducive business environment for the private sector. And the creation of the European Chamber of Commerce in Sudan is one of the instruments. We are very proud that the organization is now up and running and starting to organize activities to bring together representatives of the private sector, but also in Europe, but also here in Sudan. But we also intend to create network links to other organizations so as to give a boost to private sector development in Sudan, as we are convinced that the private sector is the prime engine for economic development. Without further ado, I would like to ask Khalid to start this first event. And I apologize that I will have to unfortunately leave you at noon, but I am very happy to be with you, and I'm looking forward very much to the contributions of the three panelists. Thank you very much, and enjoy the session.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I appreciate the support of the EU to this Chamber of Commerce. For the ones who just joined us, thank you for joining us this morning. I am Khalid Ali. I am the Executive Director of the European Chamber of Commerce in Sudan. And I'm just gonna go very quickly about what ECCS is, what it's all about, and what do we intend to be doing in the near future. This is our first event. ECCS has been started a couple of years ago, but then for different reasons and the changes that happened in Sudan, this is considered a relaunch, if you will, or the first official activity of ECCS in the post-revolution, post-political change that happened in Sudan. ECCS is a chamber of commerce, like any other chamber of commerce. The primary focus of this group would be, or this organization, would be to re-establish linkages between the Sudanese private sector and its counterpart in member states at the European Union and in Europe in general. Prior to the economic and political sanctions that were imposed in Sudan, for a very long time, Sudanese private sector enjoyed excellent relationships with the European private sector. People of my age and older remember when Siemens installed the first digital telephony exchange in Khartoum, for example, and piloted that, and other European companies that were present in Khartoum and in other places in Sudan. Now that the Sudan is going through economic reforms, major political change, we see a real opportunity in basically reintroducing the country to the world and particularly to Europe. And the private sector has a major role in doing that. Basically repositioning Sudan with all the resources that are available, all the human capital that's available, and the business opportunities for us to be able to reconnect with private sector in Europe. The sanctions imposed by the American administration and putting Sudan on the state sponsors of terrorism has posed significant challenges to this reintegration. And now that serious efforts has been made by the transition government in Sudan to get Sudan off of that list, we're trying to explore and find out what can be done. So assuming that Sudan gets confirmed and the country is being removed from this list in a couple of days, hopefully, what happens next? Are we ready? Is the private sector in Sudan ready to open up for business? Does European companies have enough knowledge about what's happening in Sudan, where the opportunities are, what market size, in which industry sector, in which vertical. These are all questions, and we thought it would be a meaningful conversation to start by looking at the banking sector, banking and financial sector in general. And for that, we wanted to take a look at the topic from 2 or 3 different angles. One, what is the government doing by way of reform to make sure that the Sudanese banking and financial sector is ready to rejoin the international financial sector? We would like to talk about policy and probably a little bit of strategy. We also want to see from a banking sector in Sudan, from commercial banks side of things, what have the private sector in Sudan been doing? What level of readiness do we have? Are we compliant? Do we still have challenges that need to be addressed before we open up for business or not? And for that, I couldn't find better than Mr. Majdi Amin, Mr. Yusuf Fatinei, and our third panelist, who's still trying to join us, but we're going to start, and he will hopefully join us at a later point to discuss the topic. I would like for Majdi and then Yusuf to introduce themselves first to the audience, our 2 panelists, and then make any opening statements that they would like to use to set the scene for the conversation. Majdi, over to you.
Thank you, Khaled. Thank you, Excellency. European Union would love to participate in this discussion, and looking forward to also the questions from all the participants. So my name is Majdi Amin. I am a senior advisor in the Ministry of Economy and Economic Planning, Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning.
And Majdi, would you like to make any opening statements regarding the advisory work that you do at the ministry right now? Anything just to set context?
Sure. If you'd like me to make my intervention now, I was thought that Yusuf was introducing himself, but I'll go ahead and make my point. So building on your comments, your opening remarks, I'm going to argue that the next 6 to 9 months provides a very unique opportunity for investors, particularly in the financial sector, to take advantage of the early stages of an economic turnaround that's sort of long awaited and badly needed. I'll start with the SMP, the staff monitored program that we're working on. I won't go through all the details, but the economics are very clear. We had a major budget deficit. We had subsidies equal to about 8% of GDP, of which fuel was around 6% of GDP. And all revenues of the government were also equal to about 6% of GDP, such that government spending, anything, health, education, security, administration, all had to be borrowed. And since we didn't have, because of the arrears situation and the sanctions, did not have access to large foreign borrowings, nor do we have a very large domestic bond market, basically that meant monetization, which then meant inflation and a declining pound, economic instability, all of which are terrible for investors. You can't invest if you have no idea what prices or costs are going to be in the next month or 6 months from now. So the formula is not very complex. I mean, it's reduce subsidies because it's such a big part of the deficit. Raise revenues, which includes customs exchange rate, but also taxation and many other sources of revenue. Remove sources of distortion, including multiple exchange rates, and structural reforms, which I'll get to, especially as it relates to the financial sector. So it's not a difficult, complex formula, but the politics are difficult. As few countries are able to do these kinds of reforms without a lot of financial support that would have allowed a very gradual path. And execution is also a challenge because it means essentially managing in a different type of environment. And so I would like to sort of, before continuing, thank the European Union for its work in financing capacity building of the central bank, including on bank resolution and other bank supervision. So again, it's difficult, but the reward is substantial. You know, if we succeed in this, we reach the HIPC decision point, high income highly indebted poor countries program would be the largest and last country to go through this program, which would allow us not only to clear our arrears. We have 56 billion of external debt, a large share of it are arrears, but then it would allow us to regain access to IDA, African Development Bank, IMF, meaning over $1 billion, maybe $1.5 billion of low-cost funding, which then allows us to invest in expanding infrastructure, agriculture, healthcare, education, all of the essentials, and not rely on monetization and budget deficit financing for investment in development. So that is a huge turnaround when we get to that point. It's difficult now, but that point is extremely important in Sudan's economic history. But you can't lift off from the current stagnation without a functioning banking sector. Ultimately, the economic space that gets created through reform and increasing investment in public goods can only be translated into jobs and economic growth by farmers, entrepreneurs in the private sector. And they need finance, especially in a growing environment. You need working capital, you need recapitalization. There's capital, private sector has been starved of capital. Unfortunately, the banking sector in Sudan has been weak. There's a lot of banks, it's 37 banks, 5 larger banks and a lot of smaller banks. But total assets of the financial sector are only about 25% of GDP. Financing to enterprises and individuals around a little less than 10% of GDP. Where you compare that in Africa, it's usually around, sub-Saharan Africa is around 20%. Lower middle income countries like Sudan is more like 33%. Higher income countries, you get to financing that it's actually equal or higher than GDP. The banking sector is mostly relying on trade rather than investment financing. Asset quality has deteriorated, and financial inclusion is extremely low. Very small share of the population has a bank account, and payment systems are pretty underdeveloped. So, in addition to the macroeconomic reforms, economic stability is really the foundation for anything, but including the financial sector. But there's also a lot of financial sector reforms. And I appreciate that I'm throwing a lot of data points at you, but there is in the works a new central bank act, a new banking act, the move to a dual banking system, already approved, but there's a transition period, or 2-month period, but reopening conventional banking rather than only Islamic banking. So it's a dual banking system. For those who prefer to stay with Islamic banking, they of course will do so. There's a lot of work going on that Jean-Francois can speak to on better modernized supervision of the banking sector. There's a new Digital Payments Act, new resolution framework, and of course the removal of Sudan from the state-sponsored terrorism list, which then removes a lot of obstacles for as correspondent banking and other kind of that really was an obstacle, a legal obstacle for many to invest in Sudan. We need more than that. It's not only that the public sector, but there needs to be new instruments to crowd in capital to agriculture and address risks and go into digital payments, for example, in order to close the financial inclusion gap. So if you put this picture together, and I was given about 7 minutes, and I'm coming up on that. You put all that together, you can see the outlines of an economic turnaround in the macro sense, and where major distortions are being eliminated, significant sources of inefficiency are being removed, and economic opportunities are being unlocked alongside, focus on economic stability. And public finance in a more significant way is coming, financing of public goods. But then what's needed is allocation of capital to take advantage of the economic opportunities that emerge, along with technology and capacity, which means that we need foreign investment in the banking sector. That's the opportunity. So if you're an investor and you want to make a diversified bet on this economic turnaround, banking provides a good vehicle for doing so. I'm not going to sugarcoat it either. There is a political transition that's full of uncertainties. There's no guarantees as to what happens. the government is doing its best on multiple fronts to make this work. There's a lot of work to be done on governance. But if if you think about the underlying economics, the steps that we're taking should lead to a much better opportunity for the banking sector. And why do I say 6 to 9 months? Because I think after that, after HIPC, after all of this starts kicking in, I think it will be much more obvious to a lot more people. And if you're an investor, you want to go in before it becomes obvious. Thank you, Khalid. I look forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you, Majdi. Very, very valuable information and data points. On the chat, somebody was asking if a write-up will be made available. Yes, at some point, ECCS will issue a policy brief on the outcomes of this roundtable. Yusuf, would you like to introduce yourself and make your first intervention before we move to questions?
Yes, thank you, Khalid. Good morning, everyone. Your Excellency, thank you for joining us and all the participants with us today. My main objective is to try to give you an insight into how banks are preparing themselves for the next stage, which we like to call in Sudan the day after, i.e. the day after all sanctions are lifted and Sudan is welcomed or invited to be reintegrated into the world. I think Mr. Majdi gave you a very good overview of the overall political and economic situation and the plans to be put in place. The banks have, a number of banks in Sudan have been looking forward to this day. And actually a number of them have already started to look into their anti-money laundering systems and manuals, train their people. And to that extent, there's actually a government specialized committee being put forward, which is very active today with government entities, the Central Bank of Sudan, the Sudan Banks Union, and a number of commercial banks that are overall assessing the existing anti-money laundering systems and guidelines and making sure that people are trained to properly identify the inherent risks associated with dealing with the banking worldwide, bearing in mind that we've been cut off from the world. So a lot has happened and we have to be up to date. So efforts are being properly put in place. They usually take time, of course, to get up to speed. Other than that, a number of banks have been looking or seeking ratings from international rating organizations and regional organizations with the hope of getting a sort of an action plan of their weaknesses and their shortcomings and where they fit and where they sit in comparison to regional and international banks. And for the investors to be able to look into a document that summarizes the actual opportunity in front of them in words and figures that they can understand and the whole world can appreciate. So that was a very interesting process, getting rated, and that will also give them a chance to look into their corporate governance manuals, internal systems and processes, and making sure that the quality of their human capital is up to international or regional standards. One point I would like to highlight here is the issue of de-risking within the banking sector or the financial sector in the world, which people like to think that it's just associated to being on a sanctions list or related to the SSTL. And de-risking actually takes a lot of other things into consideration. So it will take time for banks to learn about all the elements associated with de-risking, hence meeting the criteria to be able to open bank accounts again with their past or historic correspondence. But it's not all gloomy, it's not all bad. Ever since the announcement of possible removal of Sudan from the SSTL, we are happy to announce that some payments have made their way through in US dollars from the United States and in euros from Europe uh, into Sudan. And that was a very good sign that the banks are looking into the legal issues and the associated risks with actually effecting transfers. Now, at the same time, these same banks might be still hesitant and reluctant to open accounts or allow payments from Sudan outwards until they're confident that all the systems in Sudan or in the banking sector are in place. But I think we're at a very good start. Also very important is that a lot of the banks have been looking deeply into digital and electronic payment systems. And they've made it, we've come a long way. This is a cash-led society and the whole economy is cash-led, and in the sense that unfortunately up to date, about 90 to 95% of all trade is, or all cash is available outside the banking system. Which is a very clear indication that well, a lot of trade and a lot of people need to be reinvited or reintegrated into the banking sector in Sudan. It's moving into the right direction. The fact that the banks know about them and are working on them is in itself a good sign. And last but not least was the breakthrough that happened with actually having about, I think so far, 5 or 6 banks that have been licensed by Visa to actually issue Visa cards in Sudan. So that was a very rigorous process in terms of policies, procedures, IT security, anti-money laundering systems. These banks needed to upgrade their systems to a level to become acceptable, to be granted a license by Visa, so they could actually issue these Visa cards, and that are going to be functional all over the world, i.e. you will actually be carrying a card issued in Sudan, but that operates everywhere in the world. Unfortunately, it's still delayed in the actual issuance because this, again, is a very new product. The central bank has to look into it, make sure that the banks are also up to standard and their systems, the central bank to monitor such a product are up to standard. But we're all hopeful and optimistic that having passed the rigorous AML and systems evaluation by such an international organization or a financial sector like Visa is a very, very good sign. Adopting international accounting standards and banks having to review and make sure that their financials are aligned with international standards was also a very big step that a lot of banks were pushed into over the last 3 to 5 years, hopefully or also in anticipation of this day. And it's not going to be easy. It's going to be a tough ride. It's going to involve a lot of training, a lot of time, but I think we're all on the right track here, and everyone is just doing their part. I'll be more than happy to try and answer more specific questions if you have about the banking sector at large from a commercial perspective.
Thanks, Yusuf. Thank you very much. Very insightful commentary. I'll ask a question before we go back to Majdi. And I come from an ICT background, and I can't just help but asking about the ICT infrastructure readiness. I mean, I understand there are compliance issues. You want to talk about anti-money laundering and fighting illicit financial flows and things of that nature. To me, a digital KYC is the first point into going in that direction. If you don't know who your customer is, where they come from, what their background is, if you cannot score them, I think it becomes very difficult to talk about the rest of the chain or to improve the rest of the chain. Can you highlight a little bit what the commercial Sudanese banks are doing towards improving? I mean, for 30 years, one of the problems of these sanctions was that technology was, we were banned from, or Sudanese private sector was banned from importing high technology, and they reverted to a lot of open source and, you know, and software from vendors in other places that are not necessarily compliant or top notch. What efforts have you seen, and you're a member of a few of the committees at the banks union and what have you? What are you seeing in that space?
Okay, I'm sorry, maybe I forgot also to introduce myself. I'm Yusuf Al-Thani, I'm the CEO of United Capital Bank. I'm also a member of the Sudan Banks Union Steering Committee and head of the Risk and Compliance Committee within the Sudan Banks Union. Khalid, to answer that in a very obvious way, let me say that about 7 to 10 years back, some banks did not understand the word KYC, know your customer. They had no clue what it was. And today, I can assure you that all 37 banks are very up to date and very aware of the acronym KYC and the level of detail that is being required by these banks is almost annoying to customers, and the more annoying it is to customers, the more effective you know that it is. And also the fact that you have to meet international standards to provide information about beneficiaries or actually receiving money within Sudan means that you have to go and meet requirements or international standard requirements. Otherwise, these payments will not come in. So the fact that payments have managed to come into Sudan means that these banks were able to meet the international KYC requirements and standards. And hopefully what we're trying to do is the other way around, i.e. when we effect payments, we want the other banks on the other side of the world to feel comfortable enough that proper KYC and information about clients and the transaction and underlying reasons are also within acceptable international norms. Digital KYC is working, and I'm happy to say that the central bank has made it a requirement right now. We also have something called the EBS, the electronic banking system, which has come up with a number of systems integrated within the central bank and the whole financial sector to make KYC a more, it's still a very rigorous process, but it is much easier having been electronic. Future ideas are to try and link the different agencies, local rating agencies, central bank, and the banking sector with gathering all the information into one place where you could actually look up someone's name and automatically you will get his social or his social number or ID number or national number, which will automatically link you to his exposure within the banking sector and get an overview of his history and his banking transactions. And so we're getting there. And as I said, the fact that people now understand what the requirements are and are actually working on them is the good sign, is the optimistic vision.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Yusuf. Majdi, are you going to try to bring Jean-Francois over the phone? For the participants, our third participant, Jean-Francois Bouchard, is having technical difficulties. We'll see if Majdi can bring him through an external phone line. Majdi?
Okay, Jean-Francois, you're on.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm really sorry, but I am experiences very, very big difficulties to connect on the internet. I'm talking from the Central Bank of Sudan, and things are not really working well. So just to explain briefly what I am doing here, I am implementing a program of technical assistance with the Central Bank of Sudan in order to try to get the banking supervision in Sudan closer to international standards. So basically, we are implementing.
The line is not the clearest. If you could please come closer to the phone and maybe speak a little bit slower so that we can listen. There's a little bit of network delay. So if you can speak slower and come closer to the phone, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, I will speak slower. So we are implementing several actions with the Central Bank of Sudan. First of all, we are enhancing the banking supervision framework, meaning that we will implement a risk-based supervision. And when the market in Sudan will open to conventional banking, we will probably implement some part of the Basel Committee framework, meaning Basel II and Basel III, some part of it, of course, because the banking system is clearly not ready to implement this completely. We also are going to implement a macro-prudential supervision, meaning a framework to enhance the financial stability and to maybe be able to conduct a proactive policy to enhance this financial stability. And the other component is about AML-CFT, prevention of money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism. Of course, Sudan is lifted from the list of countries financing terrorism, and this is a very good thing. But still, there are some concerns about the quality of the AML-CFT framework, and we want to put in place some rules and some methods and some tools to better supervise the AML-CFT risk in the banks. So this is one part of the project. And we have also another big project with the European Union. So this project consists in conducting an asset quality review of the banks in Sudan in order to identify the weakest bank. So this is the first part. The second part will be to implement an enhanced banking resolution framework, meeting the international standards and providing some tools both on a legal and on an operational point of view to make some banking resolution in an adapted and structured way. And finally, once we will have, first of all, the results of the asset quality review, and second, an adapted resolution framework, then we will hopefully be able to put in place some kind of a strategy for the banking system to enhance the soundness. Most probably, one of the findings will be that with 37 banks, there is probably too many players in the banking system, and then having less banks, but more better capitalized, and maybe with foreign investors coming to take advantage of the enhanced supervision and enhanced AML-CFT framework. This will help the country to have a better financial system. So this is basically what we are trying to put in place with the Central Bank of Sudan. But of course, this is a medium-term project which will last something like 2 years.
Great.
So I hope it was.
Yes, thank you, Jean-Francois. I have to mention that Jean-Francois is currently seconded to the Central Bank of Sudan. He comes through Expertise France. in support of the reform at the central bank. Jean-Francois, since I have you on the phone and before this line goes bad again, I'm going to just ask you one question and then we'll get back to Majdi and then we go to the floor to see if there are a few questions. You mentioned 2 or 3 major undertakings and projects currently ongoing at the central bank. Can you share what are the expected outcomes and if there are any timelines that you can share with our participants today? I mean, if that detail is not available, that's fine. But I think if you give us some sense of the timelines you're working with and what concrete results do you think will come out of these efforts, I think that would be helpful.
The timelines for which part of the project are you mentioning?
For the reform at the central bank and being compliant and being on par with international standards.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. The timeline are in fact very ambitious. We will try, first of all, I mean, the asset quality review, for example, we want to have it started in January. And we want to conduct this asset quality review in January and February and have the results in March. We also want to work on the resolution framework, at least the first draft of a new resolution framework in January. We also are going to start to implement the risk-based supervision. And for this purpose, we will revise the regulations on risk management and internal control. So this will also be achieved by the end of January. Then the practical work, I mean, if you want to talk about practical outcomes, the practical work on AML-CFT will take place maybe later. And we will create a framework for assessing the risk of the banks and assessing the quality of their methods. So this will probably take place in the second half of 2021. But our expectations is to complete the full program by June of 2022. And by this moment, if of course we achieve all our objectives, we will have, first of all, identified the main problems of the banking system. We will have recommended to the authorities the appropriate resolution plan to enhance the sustainability. So this will be done but June of this year, of next year, 2021. And we will have put in place the risk-based supervision at the central bank. So this will be done by June of 2022. So you see, we have some very, very practical deadlines that have been agreed with the Central Bank of Sudan. There is a clear commitment from the Central Bank of Sudan to achieve these objectives, and hopefully, with the team of experts that will be coming here during these 2 years, we will manage to do that.
Great. Thank you. And one last question before I go back to Majdi with a question. There's a lot of conversations in Khartoum about, there are economic solutions, there's an economic reform going on, but then there's the political economy side of things. Would you say, through your experience with the central bank, and I'm sure you deal with a lot of government agencies, would you say there is a lot of political support? I mean, these are complex and difficult endeavors. I mean, you're reforming an economy that was locked for 30 years, and now all of a sudden you're changing things around. Would you say that the transitional government has been pulling its political weight and putting it behind these reforms, or are you facing challenges in that department as well?
Well, I wouldn't talk about the political issues in Sudan. I don't feel comfortable to speak about that. First of all, because I don't know enough about the political context in Sudan. I've been working here.
Just in terms of support for the projects that you're leading.
Yes, I mean the political commitment to change the banking system and to enhance the supervision, I think this is not questionable. Everybody agrees on the fact that there is a need to enhance the methods and to have more consistency with the international standards, especially if the country wants to attract foreign investors. So on this point, I think there is no discussion. I mean, everybody is on the same page. Now, maybe the discussion is about the way to achieve that, meaning that, of course, any changes, any reform will have some initial cost, and the benefit will be at medium term. So, and of course, we need to get a balance between the efforts that we need to put in place for moving forward and the outcome that we will get. So there should be a balance between the cost and the benefits, and we need to assess on a permanent basis where is the good point of balance. So, but I think on the political commitment to move forward and to change the system, here the political willingness, I should say, is there.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Please stick around. We'll go to Majdi with one question, and then we're taking 4 questions from the floor. I hope you can stay with us. Some of them might be addressed to you.
Yes, I stick with you as long as needed.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you very much. Very insightful. Majdi, back to you. You spoke about 6 to 9 months window of opportunity. What should the private sector players, not only in Europe or in international markets, but even inside Sudan, what should they expect in 2021? I mean, we have an overflow of people who wanted to register for this particular roundtable, and if you take that as anecdotal observation, just to gauge interest, there is a lot of interest in Sudan and reconnecting and doing business in Sudan. But from a practicality perspective, what should we expect? What do we look forward to in 2021 by way of being able to, I don't know, open LCs or start doing correspondence with other banks, or any of the practicalities? If you can shed some light on that.
Okay, well, thank you for the question. It's a big question. It's 2021 is, I mentioned 6 to 9 months only because I think the second half of next year or the last quarter of next year, the opportunities will be clear to a lot more people. So if you're an investor and you do your homework and you can start to understand how to sort of price the Sudan opportunity, which is substantial, and you move quickly, then as everybody decides that Sudan is an opportunity and starts to bid up asset prices, you've missed the bottom, let's say, if in a big picture sense. But you can't guarantee anything in investment. You can't make decisive sort of forward projections as to what could happen. But we are working hard to try to make sure that we reach the HIPC decision point in the first half of next year. So then at that point, that's a very key moment as far as the economic situation goes, because of the arrears clearance and the access to IDA and other foreign sources. All the while, of course, the reforms that we're doing now to stabilize the economy, they're going to be kicking in largely in 2021. So inflation is still high, and the budget deficit is still large in 2020, because in addition to the fact that the fuel subsidy removal took so long and it was very politically difficult, and is still not fully done, then you had the floods and you had COVID and you had a COVID devastated revenues, 40% decrease in revenue. So there's still a very, very large deficit and a lot of monetization this year. All of those issues, including increasing revenues and trying to streamline, at least making the budget more efficient, all that kicks in next year. And then the drivers of inflation start to decrease. In terms of practical things that happen, of course, we're looking forward to this month. What happens this month as SSTL gets removed, but then later on, legal peace, the peace agreement that's been the big subject of the government, also kicking in, also requiring a lot of fiscal and other kinds of support. I would expect to see, investment conferences of various kinds, as those who want to take advantage of the economic opportunity would want to learn more about Sudan. I would expect to see first movers come in and start take advantage, because as a sector has been closed for a long time, banking is very technological now. Banking is very technology driven, and the Sudanese banks will need to very quickly come up to speed. Those who come in and partner, let's say, with a Sudanese bank who is maybe perhaps not utilizing the opportunity created by its license, will have a first mover advantage, on many fronts. And I would expect to start seeing that. And then at that point, a process of competition start to take place that then creates the kind of banking sector that Sudan needs. As new products and services start to get introduced, the next bank may decide to do that. New corporate finance services, new retail services, new digital payments, all of these things create a dynamic which is good for an investor who wants to take advantage. And I don't know, I didn't answer your question directly, but those are some of the things that I hope to see in the next fiscal year, next calendar year.
Great, thank you very much. I'm mindful of the time. We started 10 minutes late, and I think we have like 10 more minutes, but Yusuf, do you have any comments that you'd like to offer before we take questions? I have I'm gonna take questions from the chat, and I apologize, I should have announced this at the beginning, but in the interest of being efficient with the time, I'm gonna pick the questions that are either repeating or are higher level that addresses more points. But Yusuf, do you have anything that you would like to add before we go to questions?
No, thank you, Khalid. I think we'll make better use of our time by trying to answer some questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So there's a question from Christus, and the question is addressed to Majdi and Yusuf. It says, as we all know, one of the major problems with Sudanese banking is the fact that Sudanese banking sector have fully utilized their credit lines with correspondent foreign banks. And also most of the Sudanese banks have still large dues. How do you foresee the Sudanese banks would be able to resolve this prerequisite with corresponding banks to open new credit lines for trade and finance? It sounds more like geared towards you, Yusuf. So if you can answer that, and then Majdi, if you want to jump in also, and Jean-Francois on the phone also.
Okay, let's look at the cup half full here, which is the fact that these banks have credit lines in itself is a positive sign and a move forward. You have to bear in mind that a lot of international banks were actually refusing to handle or deal with Sudanese-based transactions and businesses. So having the credit lines sometimes fully utilized because they were relatively small, and in comparison to what the European or the international market expects. At one point of time, these credit lines were zero. Now they're at a shy figure of 5 to 10 to 15 and $20 million. Rarely do we see credit lines of $50 and $100 million anymore, which were existing just let's say a few years back. So yes, the lines are full because they're relatively small, so they cannot accommodate a lot of big transactions or big deals. There are some banks that have faced problems with settling these dues. That is a fact. That is very true. And but let's say that these banks and the central bank are aware of them. They are working on it. It will take time. The fact that Sudan has very limited foreign currency resources might mean that these payments are delayed. But also the positive sign or the positive part of all this is these banks are not refusing to pay. They might be unable at the present time. So we would like to consider it more of a cash flow problem. But I think most of these issues will be resolved in the near future. And I'm aware that the central bank is trying to support these banks. A number of policies have been changed, allowing these banks to have better access and more access to foreign currency from trade business in the sector. And I think it's a temporary problem that will be resolved soon.
Thank you, Yusuf. Majdi, do you want to offer any comments on that?
I thought that was a good answer. I think downstream, I'm sorry, we have a little bit of the azan in the background, but downstream, the work that Jean-Francois is doing on the resolution framework should help. I don't think we're really, when talking correspondent banking, it's not really the type of long-term issues that some banks get into in terms of, on non-performing loans. But generally, recapitalization of banks, more confidence in the sector as a whole, should give more other correspondent banks more confidence, especially the AML CFT should give more confidence in the system in Sudan so that there are more correspondent, more credit lines. And generally the liquidity, the situation of liquidity externally should start to get resolved. I don't know if Jean-Francois might have a further comment.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. There's a question from Rushdie Hamid. Thanks, Rushdie, for joining us. Rushdie is part of the Honorary Council of European countries to Sudan. And Rushdie's question is, can the bankers here working on this give an opinion on how soon might it be able for a regular businessman in Sudan to make transfers, open lines of credit, buy and sell with the rest of the world? It's through a Sudanese bank. Is this a matter of weeks, months, or is this more complex than that? Yusuf, I see more questions coming your way. Do you want to take that one on?
Okay, well, Rushdie, from a legal perspective, it's a matter of days in the sense that once once Sudan is officially lifted off the SSTL, we're hoping by the 12th of December, the legal part of all this is done. Then starts the process of meeting the requirements of the correspondent bank into actually allowing payments originating from Sudan to be transferred. We know that it's very limited right now to UAE dirhams and through some Emirati banks. But yes, we're very optimistic that we will be able to interact with American and European-based banks very soon. A lot of banks, including ourselves, have already reached out to these banks, trying to reopen the European bank accounts in euros and even in dollar-based accounts. And they've asked for tons of legal work and paperwork, and which is being put together and sent out. The fact that they're now answering our messages and responding to our reach out is in itself a very positive sign. Sometimes we used to write these banks and they would find it safer not to even respond to a Sudanese-based bank. But now we are getting feedback about what the requirements are. They are asking more and more questions. The more they are asking, the more happy we are that we're on the right path. So in terms of legal requirements, international legal requirements, we're assuming it's days. In terms of actually meeting other side requirements, I would be, let's say, cautiously optimistic and say, give it a few more weeks and months. Hopefully not more than, let's say, 2 to 3 months. Good sign is, as I said, we've already started receiving payments from overseas into Sudan. It's the other way around that I believe you're asking about, and we are working on it, and hopefully we'll be announcing a breakthrough. And the good sign is, Rushdie, as well, is that the credit cards, the Visa cards, are actually approved, licensed, and some cards have been issued, test cards, and they're working fine. Purchases over the internet, actual cash withdrawals, and actually swiping them on machines overseas. So they've passed the test. They're fully operational. What we're actually waiting for right now is the Central Bank of Sudan's approval of this new product. And as Majdi was saying, as this market develops, as these banks start offering new products, be it Islamically based products or conventional products, this will hopefully move the market and move competition and entice banks to offer more and more products. But on this part, maybe Jean-Francois will be able to answer it a bit better, but you have to also give time to the local regulators. It's not only the commercial banks that were cut off from the world, it's the central bank as well. They've never had to, let's say, look deeply into these international payments moving the other way around via Visa cards. So you have to give them time to also review their internal policies and procedures and look at the overall effect of such a product on the economy. I'm sure we'll get there, but as with any other product, it takes time, both from the commercial perspective and from the regularity perspective. But again, guys, we're on the right track. It's a matter of time, hopefully days, weeks, not more than a few months, and we should be operative.
Thank you, Yusuf. Jean-Francois, do you want to intervene here? Majdi, you're on mute. If Jean-Francois is still on the phone and talking through your link.
Yep, go ahead. Yep, done. Go ahead, Jean-Francois.
Go ahead.
Yes, we didn't manage to fix the issues, so the internet issues. So regarding correspondent banking and international integration of the
Jean-Francois, it's really difficult to hear you. If you could please come closer to your phone and also speak a bit slowly, so we can hear you.
Can you hear me better?
A little bit better. I mean, you can try and shout a little bit, raise your voice a little bit.
I will try to speak loud.
Yes.
So, regarding correspondent banking and international relationship of the Sudanese banks with the outside world, if I can say so, in fact, there are two major issues. The first one is that the correspondent banks need to understand to whom they are talking, meaning what is the quality of the banks that they are talking to, what is relevant in the financial statement that they receive. So is the situation of the banks. So this is an issue one. The issue two is about AML-CFT. As you know, the correspondent banks are very concerned about AML-CFT, and most of the banks, especially the biggest correspondent banks in Europe, like, for example, Dresdner or Deutsche Bank or others, have a de-risking strategy. They do not want to make some business with, for a low profitability and for a high level of risk. You know, this is something that I experienced, for example, in Congo, when I was working there as a resident advisor in Central Africa. I mean, some Congolese officials were put on a list of sanctions by the US authorities. And from one day to another, all the correspondent banks wanted to escape the country and to quit for all the relationship with the Congolese banks. And in this country, it was especially complex due to the fact that the economy is very much dollarized. So you have two issues. I mean, there are two issues to manage. The first one is the possibility for the banks in Europe or in the US or in Asia to whom they are doing business, they are making business. And the second one is to get the assurance that on an AML safety point of view, there will not be any difficulties. So basically what we are doing at the Central Bank of Sudan is advocating in favor of those two elements. We will be working, first of all, on the sustainability of the banks with the resolution process, with the asset quality review. So this will bring some transparency and some visibility for the foreign banks to see to whom they are working with. And on the AML CFT framework, we are also working on enhancing the framework and just to provide some more confidence in the foreign banks. But of course, this is a matter of medium-term action. So there is some time necessary to implement those actions and then to see the effect on the international reputation of the Sudanese banks.
Great. Thank you, Jean-Francois. I'll take one more question and then we wrap up. And then, yeah, there will be a write-up following this roundtable, and just make sure that we have an active email of you if you'd like to receive that write-up. Ahmed Abdul Latif says that the banking sector reform has to be accompanied with other reforms, tax regime, exchange rate reform, etc., to ensure that the Sudanese private sector is then in position to engage with local banks and foreign banks. In particular, most finance is currently small-scale trade finance rather than feasibility-based or balance sheet-based lending. Ahmed's question to Majdi is, are there any efforts being focused to reform to that end? So other than the banking sector, is there any reform on the taxation regime, exchange rates, et cetera, et cetera? Majdi? The question is
sure, thank you. Thank you, Khaled, and thank you, Ahmed. Yes, in fact, there are efforts on both. There's a lot of efforts to strengthen the tax chamber, but there are two key reforms that are already underway or part of the agreements that we made with the international community to stabilize the economy. One is to address or remove this issue of multiple exchange rates. You have now a customs exchange rate, you have a parallel market, you have an official exchange rate. That's very inefficient because it sends the very distorted price signals. And it doesn't allow banks to capture the foreign exchange inflows that happen as a result of remittances or exports. Because if the banks are forced to offer £55, the official exchange rate, where the parallel market is, let's say, 270 or 250 or wherever it is today, all of those exporters or remittance providers would choose to go outside of the official banking sector. So you can't really develop the banking sector that way. So this removal of this parallel multiple exchange rates is going to be a key part of the policy, and that process is underway. The other is that the customs exchange rate would have to be gradually increased. Customs exchange rate, of course, is linked to customs, but it's also the valuation vehicle for VAT. So you pay VAT on the basis of the customs value of the import, and then you pay the rest later at the retail end, but most of the collection happens up front. There's some mixed collection at the retail end. So by addressing that distorted exchange rate, there's a huge impact on public revenue, which, if I think my estimation is right, about 2/3 or even more would be VAT as opposed to, let's say, personal income tax or corporate income tax. But you asked a more complex question, which also relates to different kinds of financing. There is a lot of collateralized lending, but much more is needed. And we talked about technology, especially for small businesses. and microfinance. You know, digital finance is based on information now, and even the patterns of telephone consumption and other vehicles can be used to make good credit decisions in other countries. Sudan is just far behind on all of those things. And I would say another key one is the equity market, which, you know, startups don't need loans. Startups need equity capital. You need early stage finance, angels, and then you need, you know, subsequent rounds of VC finance for those kinds of businesses that are high risk, high growth businesses. They shouldn't be taking loans, and they certainly don't have collateral. So I would say there's multiple things that are happening, and a few things that need more of a push to diversify how finance is done in the banking sector, in the financial sector.
Thank you, Majdi. There are, questions coming in and very valuable comments, but we're running out of time, and I'm respectful of everybody's presence here this morning. Before I wrap up, I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Leah Poloni, who's the program manager in the EU delegation to Sudan, responsible for public finance management and private sector development. Leah has been key to the foundation of ECCS. On a personal note, I'm very grateful for all of her support. Leah, before we wrap up. Yes, Leah, go ahead, please. Leah, you can unmute yourself and.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Absolutely.
Yes, okay. Sorry, there's again an issue with internet. It's not only
at the Central Bank of Sudan, but also
the EU delegation.
Leah, you have both your computer and phone open. Please close one of them so that we can hear you. There's an interference between the two devices that you're having. So
Yeah.
mute one and just work with one of them.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Just work with one of them.
Okay, is this better? Yeah, sorry about this. So I'm just wanted to say briefly that I'm really glad that this roundtable is taking place as it combines two programs that are supported by the EU delegation. Of course, the European Chamber, as it is an important part of the European economic diplomacy. Just a quick word on that, basically the EU economic diplomacy is helping EU businesses, particularly small and medium enterprise, to succeed in global markets. So we've been supporting EU delegation, but we're also looking at Sudanese entities such as the Public-Private Partnership Unit or the Sudanese Union of Chamber, especially in matters related to EU trade regulations. So that's one part. But to come back to also the last question that was answered by Magdi, the EU also aims to hopefully improve the investment climate. And we also have a program that supports the economic transition in Sudan that has just started. It's a 10 million program over 3 years. It will hopefully, support the institutional capacities of the Ministry of Finance, but also supporting a PFM roadmap. And last but not least, intend to stabilize the financial sector. And this is where Mr. Bouchard comes in, as he's one of our consultants through expertise. But, and I'm also, I wouldn't want to not name Youssef, who is also part of the board of directors of the European Chamber of Commerce. So thank you again for all the panel and the participants to have joined us today. And let's hope that we will have many to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Before we close this call, I just launched a very quick poll on your screens. Please answer these 4 or 5 questions before you leave. Many thanks to all of you, to our panelists, Majdi, Yusuf, and Jean-Francois. Many thanks to His Excellency, the Ambassador of the EU delegation to Sudan, and to all the participants. My apologies to the ones who registered but could not join, as we have reached the maximum allowed by technology on one meeting. But I mean, in the future, if you register early on, I mean, you'll reserve your seat, and I'll make sure the recording of this roundtable is made available. We'll send emails with the link. We'll send the write-up to everybody who registered, including the ones who were unable to attend this roundtable. Thank you very much, and have an excellent rest of the day. Thank you.
Just one quick note, please.
Yes, sure.
We noticed that there are a number of questions flying in. Maybe they develop as they see other questions or hear more remarks. So if possible, anyone who does have a question or who has had a question unanswered, please feel free to send it across, and we promise to try and answer them over the coming few days.
Thank you, Yusuf. This is very kind of you. The email to send everything to is info@eccs.sd, SD for Sudan. info@eccs.sd, and I'll collect the questions. I'll send it to the panelists, and we'll make sure some of these questions are answered. Thank you very much. Have an excellent rest of the day and week. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.